Peter Beinart, if you're familiar, he's written a lot for The Nation magazine, but he is also a professor of journalism and political science at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University of New York. And he's also the editor of editor at large, I should say, of Jewish Currents. And he's a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Beinart is the type that believes in solving the issues in between Israel and Palestine instead of just smashing them the way Netanyahu believes. But anyway, I digress. This isn't about Peter Beinart. It is about a piece he wrote, which I'm going to get to in a second. But Beinart argues in his column that I'm going to share with you in a moment that if Trump recovers from COVID-19 and refuses to accept the results of this election coming up, or if his campaign refuses to accept the results, then Beinart suggests that Democrats need to be prepared to do what opposition parties in fascist autocracies around the world so often do, and that is to appeal to the international community. This is what it's come to, truth seekers. In other words, what Beinart is suggesting is that the election results should be taken to the UN and the Organization of American States and lobby the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In other words, just raise as much hell as we can with the rest of the world. Now, that's hard for us to imagine, right, us Americans? But as Beinart points out, and I'm going to share it with you in a moment, there's a long tradition of black Americans making international appeals. And it's in the column that he wrote today that I'm going to share with you. Now, I think anyone rational hopes that it doesn't come to pass that Trump or his campaign or these filthy fascists around him refuse to accept, as he says he's going to, the results of the election if he doesn't win. But it looks like it's coming to that. And if it does, it's going to be a pivotal moment in this country's political history. In other words, if it comes to pass that this fascist son of a bitch Trump refuses to accept the results of the election, then we're going to be forced to question the entire mythology of the so-called exceptionalism of the United States. And we're going to have to confront the fact that, yes, it could happen here. This is what Peter writes. The rightful president of Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, appeared via video last month before the United Nations Human Rights Council. She declared that her country's August election had been, her word, stolen. Despite objections from a representative of the Belarusian government who said she had no right to address the body, Ms. Tikhanovskaya implored the United Nations to act. She insisted, quote, standing up for democratic principles and human rights is not interfering in internal affairs. It is a universal question of human dignity, end quote. No one knows how Donald Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis will affect his presidential campaign, but before falling ill, he repeatedly suggested that he won't accept the results of the election should he lose. In that case, Joe Biden should follow Ms. Tikhanovskaya's example and appeal to the world for help. For many Americans, raised as we were to see the United States as the natural leader of the so-called free world, for many of us, it may be hard to imagine requesting foreign intervention against tyranny in our own land. But as historians like Gerald Horne and Carol Anderson have detailed, there's a long history of Black Americans doing exactly that. From 1845 to 1847, Frederick Douglass delivered more than 180 speeches imploring British audiences to intervene against American slavery. After World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson unveiled the 14 points that he hoped would structure the post-war world, the National Equal Rights League, led by William Trotter and Ida Wells Barnett, asked the Paris Peace Conference to adopt a 15th point: the elimination of civil, political, and judicial distinctions based on race or color in all nations. And after World War II, the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois edited a 94-page pamphlet that the NAACP presented to every ambassador to the United Nations, the new United Nations. It declared, quote, "Peoples of the world, we American Negroes appeal to you. Our treatment in America is not merely an internal question of the United States. It is a basic problem of humanity, of democracy," end quote. In 1951, the entertainer, activist Paul Robeson handed UN officials a 200-page document alleging that America's treatment of its black citizens violated the organization's Convention Against Genocide. In 1964, Malcolm X beseeched Africa's newly independent governments to, quote, "recommend an immediate investigation," end quote, into American racism by the UN Human Rights Council. This June, relatives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and Michael Brown endorsed a letter calling on the UN, quote, "to urgently convene a special session on the situation of human rights in the United States," end quote. Joe Biden is not W.E.B. Du Bois, let alone Malcolm X. But the party Biden leads now faces chronic racist disenfranchisement. The more the Democratic Party becomes a vehicle for black political empowerment, the less its votes count. Democrats must now win the popular vote by 3, 4, or even 5 percentage points to be assured of winning the Electoral College. They must achieve that margin in the face of a strenuous Republican effort to ensure that many Democratic ballots are not even counted. And even if they overcome both of those obstacles, Mr. Trump may still not concede. That's why the appeal by Du Bois to the world remains so relevant. By impeding black voters, the United States still violates the democratic principles it has helped enshrine into international law. After observing America's 2018 midterm elections, a team from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe cataloged a long list of undemocratic practices, from the disenfranchisement of former prisoners to the District of Columbia's lack of congressional representation to discriminatory voter identification laws, and concluded that in critical ways, American elections, quote, contravene the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's commitments and international standards with regard to universal and equal suffrage, end quote. What Mr. Trump is doing this year, the election monitoring expert Judith Kelly, the dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke, recently told the Boston Globe. What Trump is doing this year is the kind of activity that international election observers, quote, would go to countries and write up huge reports about and say, red flag, end quote. Democrats should spend the coming weeks working to ensure that this year's Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's observer mission, despite being banned from many states, especially in the Deep South, can do exactly that. Observe. Then, if Mr. Trump and his allies halt the counting of ballots or disregard them altogether, Democrats should use the European organization's report as evidence in an appeal to the same body where Miss Tikhanovskaya made hers, and that is the UN Human Rights Council. The Democrats should also lodge a complaint with the Organization of American States, a regional organization that has pledged, quote, to respond rapidly and collectively in defense of democracy, end quote, and which in 2009 used that mandate to suspend Honduras after its government carried out a coup. Now, to professed political realists, this may sound laughably naive. In practice, international do-gooders at the United Nations and Organization of American States are virtually powerless against the most powerful government on earth. But that's not the point. While appealing to international bodies may not change the election's result, it could change the Democratic Party itself. Today, many prominent Democrats remain enthralled by the very myths about American exceptionalism that black activists have long challenged. These prominent Democrats routinely exempt American behavior from the international standards to which they demand other countries comply. If, for example, China regularly sent drones into other countries to conduct extrajudicial killings, not just of suspected terrorists, but also of government officials, Democrats would denounce it as a grave violation of, quote, the rules-based international order, end quote, that Democrats extol. But when the Trump administration assassinated Qasem Soleimani, one of Iran's most powerful officials, in January, Mr. Biden said he, quote, deserved to be brought to justice, end quote, and worried merely about the killing's practical effects. The 2020 Democratic platform mentions international law just once. Americans are not so inherently virtuous that they can safely disregard the moral discipline that international oversight provides. The three black activists I mentioned understood that from brutal firsthand experience. And now that Joe Biden and other white Democrats are tasting disenfranchisement themselves, they need to learn that lesson too. Peter Beinart writing a new op-ed column that he'll be writing periodically for the New York Times. Do you know there are countries around the world right now, allies of ours, who will not even recognize our passports because we are American? We cannot get into their countries. Oh, I know it's because of the pandemic, right? Wrong. It's because of who we are and what we represent. Vis-a-vis the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, but it's becoming even beyond that. We should all understand this, and it should be making us so goddamn, first of all, frightened, but secondly, resistant. You can't become resistant until you at first take a look at what it is that's facing us. And yes, the initial response, if you're human, is going to be fear. Like, what the hell? How do I fight this demon? What do I do? And then you set aside that questioning panic and you figure out how to resist. This is where we are. Just like the Sri Lankan writer said, you Americans don't understand. It's already happened to you. The decay is setting in. It's already there. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.